Year 40 AF, after Fallout, the burden of memory. I was sitting on an edge where the Romanian told me was the Black Sea. Now it's just a vast, glittering expanse of saline mud and strange, brittle grasses, a horizon line that refuses to meet the sky. They say the dead weigh more than the living, but I think the past is the heaviest burden of all. I am Nikolai, and my inheritance is the ghost of a dead continent. The air here in the foothills, what was once called Romania, always smells of pine and metallic dust. A scent the elder, my grandfather Vlad, says is just the land settling, but I know is the lingering breath of the great miscalculation. We live in a valley carved deep into the coastal hills of the Dobrogea region, protected by rock and fog, a place where the mutated flora grows thick and the memories grow thin. Most people here, my generation, want only the simple logic of survival: food, water, shelter. They hate the questions I ask. They especially hate the old man's answers. I turned 20 summers this year, but my elder still calls me boy. My task is the opposite of survival. I am the recorder. I am trying to stitch together a history from ruins, to find the single, unbroken thread of foolishness that led the before world to suicide. And every time I try, the thread pulls taut and threatens to choke me. My workbench is cold stone in what used to be a crypt, lit by a flickering fat lamp. On the slab before me rests the archive, a stack of brittle yellowed paper, Vlad's first journal, a few corroded hard drives I can never decipher, and a pencil stub I sharpened to a needle point with my survival knife. I live for these sessions. I woke up before the sun was fully up, not by choice, but because the wool blanket had shifted. The elder was gone. I stayed still, pretending to be tangled in sleep, just to give him the space he needed to collect his thoughts. Vlad often claims he needs the solitude of the ruins to bring the memories into focus, to ensure he gives me the right history, the one that will root our future. A few moments later he was back, leaning over me with his hands on his knees. His breath was shallow, but his voice was urgent. "Nikolai, boy, are you awake? Wake up. I got more to tell before I forget, and make sure you put all this in details and don't miss a thing." "I am awake and ready, elder," I said, scrambling up and pulling the blanket away from the damp stone. I sat and watched him settle, already gripping the pencil. He didn't wait for me to open the book. His eyes were wide, seeing the ghost of a world I never knew. Back then, in the world I lived in when I was your age, it was very different. It was green, loads of trees and modern apartments we were living in, and cars that you never saw. But someday I will get you to the ashlands, so I can show you what they are. He paused, his gaze fixing on the blank page. All this fallout was avoidable, but the pride got the best of humans. Back in the day was a place called the United States of Europe, USE. That was a union of 27 countries, yes, countries they were called. And far in the northwest was the United States of America, USA. "Wow, that was a thing," I yelled out loud, astonished by the sheer volume of lost nations. Yes, they were a lot of countries, nearly 200 of them. The problems became when what we know now as the Ashlands, that was the USE, and their alliance with the USA. They did have arguments with the Eastern White Land, known as Russia. Russia was the biggest country as landmass. My pencil was dancing, trying to keep up with the cascading details. They tried to reach an understanding, but the truth was always sabotaged. And in the winter of 2022, yes, it was a year, the war broke out. Russia was alone against the Western countries that they were keep feeding the war by giving money and arms. They warned the West that they crossed the line quite a few times and they were very serious about their country's security. The West never listened to their concerns, they called them names, and they were keep arming a place that was called Ukraine back then. Half of its population was wiped out, some in exile in the USE. Vlad leaned in and his voice dropped to a heavy whisper. "It was a 10-year war, Nikolai. 10 years of pushing the border, 10 years of draining the world's resources, 10 years of a cold arrogance that said, 'We are right, and you are disposable.' The turning point was when the USA gave those rockets, some type of surface-to-air missile, that were capable of carrying nuclear warheads. As soon as they fired the first one, the Russians saw it as an existential threat. Vlad finally exhaled a ragged, wheezing sound. They launched their nukes. The USE and the USA followed with their own. That was the catastrophe. That was when the sky turned red. I wrote the last phrase, not with a pencil, but with a piece of my own soul. The sky turned red. I closed the journal, needing a moment for the weight of the past to settle on me. I looked down at the pencil, then up at the elder, whose eyes were still fixed on the ghost of the ash-choked winter of the war's final year. My mind couldn't hold the weight of all that political madness. It fixated on a detail that seemed more tangible. "Elder," I asked, my voice barely a squeak, How were you crossing all that land? Were there waters back then? World waters? If they were, where are they? It looks like someone pulled the plug and drained it. What water did they have names for?" Vlad blinked, pulling himself back from the inferno of the past into the quiet of our crypt. He understood that sometimes a child needed a physical reality to anchor the unbearable truth. The catastrophe, Nikolai, didn't just burn the cities, it fractured the Earth's veins. The sheer heat and the dust veil changed the climate, changed everything. The basin you sat on this morning, the one near the Black Sea, it was the Pontus Euxinus to the Romans. We called it the Black Sea. It was deep, vast, a connection to the whole world. He paused, a genuine sadness touching his lips. Now it's mostly gone, swallowed by fissures and simply evaporated in the first decade of the new climate. We crossed it on foot, boy. In the years just after the fallout, the ashlands, the only water you needed to worry about was the water you carried, because the world's heart had stopped pumping. He pointed toward the southwest. But one water source is eternal, though thin now, the Danube. It's the river that saved us, following the mountains and still flowing. It was always the true backbone of this land, and it still runs even if it's only a trickle now. I opened the journal again, writing down those beautiful forgotten names: Pontus Euxinus, Black Sea, Danube. I realized the land itself had a vocabulary of loss. I wanted to know more, so many things to ask, and it seemed like I wanted to rush him to tell me everything. But I didn't want to get him upset. I knew he was living those moments again as he told me, and I didn't want him to shut down on me. I wanted the whole story, but not at the expense of the storyteller. I put the pencil down. "Look, Elder, I know it's very hard for you to relive those moments again. If you want, we can leave it for another time." He looked at me then, truly looked, the distant memory fading from his eyes. A small, dry smile touched his lips. "You are just like me, kid. Thank you." He leaned forward and tapped the journal with a gnarled finger. "And I promise to not leave anything out. The truth is the only legacy I have left." I nodded. The session was over for the day. I covered the archive with the cloth and watched Vlad walk back toward the entrance, moving stiffly but with purpose. The sky was the color of old copper, and I knew that tomorrow, the memory of the 10-year war and the red sky would demand to be written down again. I was packing my notebook when the elder turned his face back toward me. The switch was immediate, from the heavy melancholy of the past to the sharp pragmatism of the present. "Nikolai," he called, his voice now flat and authoritative. "We need to find some food. Let's go north towards the ashlands." My heart sank, not because of the journey, but the direction. North? Isn't that where the radiation is worst? "It is," Vlad confirmed, already tying the thin bedroll to his pack. "But I know a place up north just before the deepest ashland. It was called Bakau back then. There was a farm, a big one, and if we are lucky, maybe we can find some maggots. We need that to make our own maggot farm for proteins." I stared at him. The history of nations and the death of continents was one thing. This visceral reality was another. "Maggots?" He didn't flinch. His expression was grim, reflecting the harsh truth of year 40 AF. "Yep, we're gonna die without proteins, and those can provide the amounts we need for each day to survive. Now hurry up, the copper sky is getting bright. We need to be back before the long shadows fall." I grabbed my pack, shoving the precious journal inside. The mission was clear: Bakau, for maggots. I was the historian of the past, but the elder was the master of the ugly present. The iron road to Bakau. We moved fast, Vlad's old legs showing a surprising endurance when survival was the goal. The land immediately north of our valley was a silent, sprawling graveyard. The soil was a sickly gray, but in the distance the radiation sickness had given the mutated trees a strange, unsettling shade of violet. We soon hit the main thoroughfare, the cracked remnants of a paved road that ran toward the north. We called it the Iron Road. It was less a road and more a scar, a line of fused asphalt choked with the rusted husks of before-world transport. Vlad called them cars, metallic tombs that now served as shelter for scavengers and the smaller, quick-moving, irradiated insects. We kept wide of them. Anything the metal hid was probably waiting for a heartbeat to chase. The elder navigated by the bones of the land, using the sun's strange angle and the peaks of the Dobrogea hills, still visible through the copper haze. See that? Vlad pointed to a jagged skeletal tower jutting out of the northern mist, a twisted metal relic half melted by the initial blast's heat. It leaned precariously, like a drunken god. That's the edge. We call it the Silent Sentinel. Used to be a tower that sent out voices and images. Now it just tells you where the heat is worst. I squinted. The Sentinel was the marker everyone feared. Beyond it was the deep ashland where no animal dared tread, and where the radiation was so thick it made the very air hum. Bakau was in the narrow, irradiated belt just before the Sentinel's shadow fell. Why Bakau, Elder? Why risk the Sentinel? I asked, pulling my scarf higher over my mouth. The dust was catching in my throat. Because the soil there was rich and it was mostly shielded by those rolling hills you see, he rasped. The contamination wasn't instantaneous. And maggots, Nikolai, they need decay and darkness, and there's plenty of that in an old food cellar. If they survive the blast and the corrosion, they breed fast. They are the only pure protein we can trust now. They don't feed on the dust, they feed on the ruins. The reality of our mission was settling on me. I was carrying the weight of the past, but I was risking my life for a barrel of plump, writhing larvae. It was the ultimate bitter irony of the afterworld. We walk the graves of giants, hunting worms to live one more day. Curiosity got the best of me. We had been walking for hours, and the hulking forms of the cars, these metal graves, were starting to blur into one continuous rusting monument to a forgotten age. Something small and rectangular near the base of a tilted blue husk caught my eye. I stopped and knelt down, ignoring the elder's nervous glances. I reached into the radioactive dust and pulled it out. It was a small metal plaque, crudely rectangular, stamped with faded numbers and letters. In one corner, though, was something that stood out. A small emblem, painted blue, with a dozen faint stars arranged in a circle. The elder saw me. His face went dark, the skin pulling taut over his bones. What did I tell you? Don't touch anything. Then he saw what I had in my hand. His panic receded, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. He walked back, his eyes fixed on the metal plate. That, he said, his voice softer now, is a car. I remembered I wanted to show you what a car is, and that you hold is what was called a registration plate. He knelt beside me, tracing the faded numbers with a trembling finger. I never got to drive one myself. They needed a special permission to do it, a driver's license. I stared at him, holding up the strange, rusted relic. A what? He repeated. A driver's license, a piece of plastic that gave you permission to operate a metal box. Millions of them. It was ridiculous. He laughed, a dry, coughing sound, and it wasn't cheap. I pointed to the emblem. The stars, Elder. What are these? He took the plate, flipping it over once, and the laugh was entirely gone. His voice was cold, heavy with a final, crushing weight. That, Nikolai, was the flag, the official symbol of the United States of Europe. I looked at the blue circle of stars, the symbol of the alliance that fueled the 10-year war, now lying inert in the dust, as meaningless as the twisted metal it once belonged to. It was the mark of the great, proud, powerful men who had been utterly wrong. I quickly shoved the plate into my canvas satchel, unable to look at it any longer. Let's move, Elder, I murmured, before the Sentinel moves. We continued north. The image of the blue stars burned into my mind, a tiny piece of history's hubris that I was now carrying into the ashlands. I didn't stop for anything else. I wanted to, because so many things I saw were screaming for my attention. The skeletal remains of buildings, the strange flowers, the sheer crushing scale of the waste, but I knew that the memories were killing the elder slowly. I saw it on his face every time he spoke of the before world. He was holding so many things, I think, just to keep me safe, and he knew that curiosity and ambition, if they are misplaced, can only add bad consequences or even death, just like the 10-year war. We finally reached the farm he was telling me about. It was a cluster of stone ruins, almost entirely buried in dust and mutated vines, but Vlad pointed to a slight depression. There was a cellar, just like he told me, deep underground, dark, and humid. We got to the narrow, crumbling staircase. Vlad pulled a small, damp rag from his pocket and pressed it over his mouth. While heading down the stairs, he whispered, "Watch out, boy, and don't be scared. Light up that torch so we don't crush anything under our feet." The air immediately grew heavy, wet, and smelled of sour earth and old decomposition. I fumbled with my flint and tinder, finally coaxing a flame onto the twisted wick of the small tallow torch. The moment the light flooded the small space far in the back, tucked into a corner, I could see some little sparks, like tiny erratic fireflies caught in cobwebs. The elder turned to me, his face tight and his eyes wide, reflecting the flickering light. "Stop there, don't follow. If something happens, run as fast as you can, you understand?" My whole body was shaking, but I managed to nod. "Yes," I whispered, ready to run. The elder, without waiting, started moving slowly, painfully toward the sparks. I heard him talking, a low, guttural murmur that wasn't directed at me. "Elder?" I asked, my voice barely audible above the echoing drip of water. "Who are you talking with? Me?" He didn't turn around, but his voice came back firm, a warning to me and a quiet offering to the darkness. "No, Nikolai. It is a man here. He is quiet, maybe scared. Now, like I said, run if something happens, okay?" I stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, the torchlight illuminating the wet, packed earth floor. The little sparks in the corner were the only other light source, and between them and me stood my elder, talking quietly to a stranger he hadn't even seen yet. The silence after his words was heavier than the dust outside. The man in the cellar. The sparks were not fireflies. As Vlad got closer, I saw they were the faint, dying reflections of the torchlight in a pair of eyes. The eyes of a man huddled behind a stack of rusted barrels. He was thin, covered in grime, and shaking violently. He wasn't armed. He was simply broken. Vlad knelt slowly, ignoring the dirt, placing his own hand palms up on the floor in a gesture of peace. "We're not scavengers," Vlad said, his voice soft, almost liturgical. "We're just two souls looking for a bit of protein to keep the clock ticking. I'm Vlad, and the boy behind me is Nikolai. We mean you no harm, friend." The man didn't look up, but his shaky, rasping voice filled the silence. He was weeping, a sound more awful than any shriek. "Go away, please, just leave me here. She's gone, and I should be with her." He gestured weakly to the shadows beside him. There was a small, blanket-wrapped bundle, terribly still. "She tried to keep the cold out. She made it 3 more days after the fever started. 3 days. What's the point now? I pulled the pin on the world, but I'm still here." Vlad did not move. He let the despair hang in the humid air, letting the man talk himself down. "You're wrong," Vlad finally said, his voice firming, the voice of the elder, the survivor. "You are not still here by accident. Your wife knew the world was ending, friend. She fought the fever for 3 days because she knew the difference between a natural death and a self-inflicted one. She died fighting." He pointed a steady finger toward the still bundle. "You're talking about ending your life. You think her sacrifice, her 3 days of pain holding on to the last breath of the before world, should be in vain? That her last act of fight was meaningless because you decided to quit? No. You don't get to do that to her memory." The man finally looked up at Vlad. His eyes were red, but the despair was mixed with a flicker of challenge. "What else is there?" the man whispered. "Just rot in the dust. There's nothing to build." Vlad looked past him, seeing the potential for life in the darkest part of the cellar. There is protein, there is tomorrow, and there is a small community 2 days south that needs a strong pair of hands. Your wife's last act was to buy you 3 days of time. My proposal is this. You help us gather what we came for. You and your wife. We will carry you both back to our shelter. We will lay her to rest with dignity, and you will teach us how to care for these ruins. We will start a maggot farm. We will survive in her name. Is that nothing? The man was quiet for a long time. The only sounds were the slow drip of water and the crackling of my torch. Then, a single shuddering sob escaped him. Bacau was her home, he choked out. Her family owned this farm. Then we honor it by growing life from its decay, Vlad countered. We become the root of the new future. We need your hands and your strength. Give me your name, friend. Marius, the man replied, finally taking Vlad's outstretched hand. My name is Marius. I let out the breath I didn't realize I was holding. The simple act of saving a life felt more difficult and far more important than recording the death of a continent. We hadn't found the maggots yet, but Vlad had found something much rarer and more valuable. A comrade. We now had a much heavier load for the journey home. The elder looked at me and said quietly urgent, Vino Nikolai, Vino Aisi. Come Nikolai, come here. He needed the torchlight directed so he could assess Marius and the rest of the cellar. Marius looked at me, a flicker of something in his wet red eyes, and he whispered, Estibayatu Louis? Are you his boy? I replied to him, Da. Yes. It wasn't the literal truth, but it was the only truth that mattered. Marius gave me a look of immense weariness, a deep, bone-tired sorrow. You are so lucky to have him, he said about the elder. He is a good man. Vlad wasted no time on sentimentality, directing Marius toward the back corner where the farm's initial stock lay. Marius, moving with a defeated resignation, pointed out the source. We found some small piglets that had died a day before, the natural death of the runts that Vlad had expected. We wrapped the small, cold carcasses tightly in spare canvas, the raw material for our protein farm, and put them carefully in the bags. Vlad then took the blanket-wrapped bundle of Marius's wife and carefully secured it using 2 long, straight pieces of broken wood found nearby and his own belt, fashioning a rigid back carrier. It was an act of profound, silent respect. As I took the heavy bag of piglets, I felt the air shift. I looked up at the broken ceiling of the cellar, imagining the sky above. Can he walk, Elder? Let's go. Let's go back before it's getting dangerous. The buzzards might show up in the area. I was thinking of the large mutated scavengers that followed the scent of death and were not afraid of weak men. Vlad looked at Marius, who nodded stiffly, accepting the command. He can walk, Vlad confirmed. And you are right, boy. We have what we came for, and a bonus besides. Let's move, quickly and quietly. Marius, leaning heavily on Vlad's shoulder, cast one final broken glance at the blanket-wrapped bundle in the shadows. He didn't speak again. The 3 of us climbed the crumbling steps, emerging from the humid, dark silence of the cellar back into the copper light and the deadly quiet of the ashland's edge. The weight of the living and the dead. The journey back was a grueling reversal of the morning's quick pace. Now we were 3. Vlad and Marius, an unlikely pair of survivors, and me, carrying the burden of new life and old death. The twin weights of the piglet carcasses in my sack and the knowledge that Marius's wife was just a few feet away, strapped like precious cargo, pressed down on my shoulders. Vlad took the lead, Marius staggering beside him, his gaze fixed on the dust-choked ground. Vlad had promised dignity, and now they had to run from the buzzards to deliver it. These scavengers were massive, with iridescent diseased feathers and hooks for claws, and they were drawn to fresh meat and decay like the old-world politicians were drawn to pride. They could smell the piglets and the body from miles away. We were moving as fast as Marius could manage, a slow, agonizing limp. Every time Marius stumbled, Vlad would steady him with an arm stronger than his years suggested, whispering low in Romanian, words of survival and fierce command. We move for her. Vlad grunted to Marius as they passed a rusted car husk. We move, so her fight means something. We will bury her where the sun can still reach the soil, and no creature will touch her. Marius only mumbled a reply, lost somewhere between despair and the will to follow Vlad's strength. I kept glancing at the sky, expecting the silhouette of the buzzards to blot out the copper light. The iron road was no longer a path to be traversed, but a desperate race against the circle of life and death in the afterworld. We had traded an empty future for a load of decay, and now the price of that trade was speed. We hit the final stretch of the iron road, where the ground began to slope down into the familiar valley. Just as relief was about to loosen the tension in my shoulders, a sound ripped through the quiet dusk. A deep, metallic snarl, far louder and more sustained than any mutated animal. The metal monsters, I gasped. Vlad didn't need to confirm. He shoved Marius forward, his own eyes wide with urgency. The sound was the unmistakable, bone-shaking roar of raiders' vehicles, hulking, armored cars that had been crudely refitted with spiked plating and scavenged engines. They were fast. They were hunting. And they were close. The shriek of their engines mingled with a high-pitched manic cawing. The buzzards, emboldened by the noise, were closing in too. "Run, Nikolai! Don't look back!" Vlad roared, injecting a burst of desperate speed into Marius. We flew down the slope, the heavy bag digging into my spine. The vision of the buzzards' shadows and the terrifying, grinding approach of the raiders' cars pushing us forward. The three of us, the recorder, the elder, and the broken man with his dead wife strapped to his back, collapsed through the hidden fortified entrance of our shelter. Vlad barely had time to slide the thick stone slab back into place before he was grabbing the tallow torch from my trembling hand. He plunged the sputtering wick deep into a bucket of damp sand, extinguishing the flame with a single harsh hiss. In the sudden absolute blackness, the roar of the metal monsters passed directly overhead, the vibrations shaking the stone around us. We held our breath, the scent of dust and fear thick in the air. The hunt was on, and we were its quiet, desperately concealed prey. The quiet community. The roar faded, the metallic snarl retreating into the north, carrying the buzzard's hunger with it. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like a presence. Vlad let out a slow, deliberate breath, then reached to a different part of the wall, touching a sequence of stones. There was a low, grinding sound, not the slide of the front slab, but the opening of an interior door. A low, steady, warm light spilled out, and the air immediately became fresher, carrying the scent of damp earth, dried herbs, and human warmth. "It's clear," Vlad announced, stepping into the light. "The dogs are gone." The crypt I thought was just a personal workshop was actually the airlock to the vault, our home. It wasn't a crypt at all. It was a carved-out cathedral of rock, a massive bunker hidden deep beneath the Dobrogea foothills. The light came from a single centrally vented pit of carefully guarded chemical fire, and it illuminated the faces of nearly 200 survivors. They were everywhere. Women mending clothes near the fire, men sharpening crude tools, and children, the post-Fallout generation, who played silent, dust-caked games in the tunnels. They looked up at us, but no one spoke. Noise was the enemy. The new generation, my peers, looked at me, Nikolai, with a mixture of pity and contempt. They had simple lives. I had the madness of history. The community moved swiftly to help. A small, efficient group took Marius, carefully easing the precious bundle of his wife from his shoulders. They carried her into a smaller chamber set aside for the newly dead, and Vlad followed, his task of finding dignity now complete. The burial took place 3 days later in the most stable corner of the vault, a small private ritual of remembrance. Marius, scrubbed clean and wearing borrowed, mended clothes, stood straight but hollow. He had done his part. He had fought the fever for 3 days, and now he was resting. When the ritual was done, Marius simply sat alone by the fire pit, a man unmoored from his anchor. I gave him those 3 days. I was 20 years old, and though the adults still treated me as the boy recorder, I was driven by a need to know that transcended simple obedience. I needed his part of the story, the parts Vlad's military mind skipped over. On the fourth day, I found Marius near the water collection cistern. He looked up, his eyes less frantic, settling into a deep, permanent sadness. I sat opposite him. You called them Germans, Italians, French. I began quietly, pulling out my pencil and the journal. You said they spoke different tongues. Elder Vlad said they were tribes, but he was lying. They were countries, weren't they? Like the United States of Europe. Marius smiled faintly, a shadow of the man he once was. No, the elder didn't lie, Nikolai. He just simplified. In the end, they were tribes. But before, yes, they were countries. Think of them like families living in their own enormous houses next door to one another. Each house had its own style, its own language, its own songs. He leaned forward, tracing a pattern in the damp earth. The Germans, they were precise, efficient. They built machines and had rules for everything. The French? They were all about beauty and passion. They loved their wine and their art. And the Italians? They were the heart of everything. Loud, expressive, obsessed with food and family. They had trade routes, yes. They moved goods all over the continent. Not for protein, Nikolai. For pleasure. Pleasure? I wrote the foreign word, feeling the weight of its meaning. Like a child's game? No. Marius shook his head, looking up at the cavern ceiling. It was far more complex. Imagine needing something that wasn't survival. Something unnecessary. That was pleasure. They traded not only goods, but a thing called money. Pieces of paper or metal discs that represented the work you had done. You could exchange them for almost anything. Clothes, food, an apartment, a seat on one of those metal cars. He paused, a true weary exhaustion entering his voice. And they spent generations arguing over the right amount of that imaginary money. Who should have more? Who deserved less? That pride in their separate houses, their distinct ways of life, is what let the politicians convince them to fight the war. The great powerful houses of the USE and the USA, looking down their noses at Russia, convinced themselves their way of life was worth killing the world for. Marius pointed to the blue star emblem I had carried back from the Ashlands, now resting on a stone beside the archive. That little circle of stars? That was supposed to mean unity, but they only used it to protect their trade and their money. When it came time to save the world, they just saw it as a flag worth dying and killing everyone else under. I stared at the emblem, then back at Marius. His history was less about bombs and borders, and more about the strange, beautiful, unnecessary things people valued. Did the Germans or the French or the Italians have anything to do with the nukes? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Marius sighed, the sound echoing in the massive cavern. They were all part of the USE, Nikolai. They all followed the alliance. They all believed the pride was worth the risk, and now they are all just names for the dust. I began writing, the pencil scratching furiously. The story was becoming so much bigger, so much more complex than just the 10-year war. It was a history of human flaw, wrapped in forgotten colors and currencies. The weapon of hunger. Marius paused, running a hand over the rough stone of the cistern. He was preparing to talk about the deeper rot, the political machinations that came before the final rocket launches. You asked about the money and the trade, he continued, his voice hardening with fresh anger. That was the key. The USE and the USA knew they couldn't beat Russia quickly on the battlefield, so they tried to starve them. They applied what they called sanctions. I stopped writing. Sanctions? What is that? Marius shook his head, looking disgusted. Yes, Nikolai, sanctions. It was a punishment, as they called it, a way for the USE to try and crash Russia's economy, to slow their money flow to a complete stop. The idea was that the suffering of the Russian people would get so bad, they would revolt against their own masters, their government, and force them to surrender. He scoffed, spitting a dry piece of dust toward the fire pit. But it didn't work as they thought it would. The masters found other ways to get their money, and the people just suffered quietly. And while they were trying to ruin the East, the USE itself was dependent on Russian gas and oil to heat their homes and run their transport. The people needed it to live a decent life. So what did they do? I asked. They stopped buying it from Russia in a desperate attempt to look strong. Instead, they started buying the gas and oil from the USA, which was much, much more expensive. The cost of fuel went up, and the price of everything else followed. People had to pay more and more until they couldn't anymore. Marius leaned in, his gaze intense. More and more people were left without houses, without money for warmth, and without food? I was astonished. Food? But you just told me they were trading for pleasure. Even then, was there a food problem like now? In some ways, Nikolai, yes, not like our scarcity, where we risk our lives for maggot meat. Their problem was different. They grew enough food for everyone, but the cost, the money, kept it locked away. There was a huge gaping crack between the rich and the poor. The rich lived in towers and ate until they were sick, and the poor slept on the streets and scavenged. It was a corruption of plenty, not a shortage. It was a crack just as wide as this big, empty nothing that used to be the Black Sea. So what did people do about it? I asked, feeling a powerful, shared rage on behalf of those ghosts. Marius's face twisted into an expression of defeat. Nothing, Nikolai. They marched along the streets of many countries in the USE. They raised their voices and demanded fairness, an end to the war, and cheaper warmth, but they were silenced. He lowered his voice. They were blackmailed and lied to because the head of the whole USE alliance was a woman, an old lady. She was German, I think. I don't know exactly. She was the one driving the sanctions, the one pushing the expense. There was a rumor that some grandpa of hers was tied to another horrible war a very long time ago. A war before this one. I paused, absorbing the depth of the legacy. There was another 10-year war before? So why was this 10-year war the worst? Marius's eyes were bloodshot with bottled-up fury. The name was a venom in his mouth. Her name was, as many like to call her, von der Liar, because she was a liar. I exhaled sharply, looking at the man whose face was full of anger, a living testament to the destructive power of one person's choices. What a name, I told myself, barely whispering it so Marius couldn't hear. Marius finally answered my question, his voice dropping to the final, indisputable truth. The difference, Nikolai? The very simple difference between that old, long-ago war and ours? Nukes. They used nukes. That's why we're in a cave instead of a house, and that's why the sea is dead. The elder came around. He looked first at me, then at Marius, immediately understanding the dark current of our conversation. He didn't lecture us. He just interrupted the cycle of despair with a command to action. Enough for today, kid Nikolai, Vlad said, his voice flat with finality. I know you like to hear the stories of the before world, but we need to start working now. We have to build the maggot farm, and then we need to go out to see what material we can find. Maybe we'll even build a metal monster ourselves. It would be a great help for us. Vlad turned his attention to Marius, the pragmatist recognizing an opportunity. Do you know anything about cars and engines, Marius? He asked. Marius calmly replied, the technical answer cutting through his emotional exhaustion. Yes. I was a driver and a mechanic at a repair shop in Moynesti. I was a part-time carpenter, too. I saw Vlad's face light up with a genuine spark of excitement, a rare sight. You are a treasure here, Marius, he said, before immediately tempering his enthusiasm with the core law of the vault. But we are all equals here, Marius. Let's not make the same mistake they did in the past. Respect is our money now, so welcome home, Marius. Vlad clapped his hands together, signaling the transition from history to survival. Now let's see what we can find for our needs. I looked at them both. They had become something I couldn't describe to myself, like brothers forged in just a blink of an eye. In that moment, I told myself, I need to become a driver. I must master the metal monster. This is my moment to prove to Elder Vlad that I am no longer just a kid. The new necessity, tools and engines. The vault, our refuge, was suddenly energized by the promise of the metal monster. The community understood the potential. A vehicle meant faster scavenging runs, the ability to escape raiders, and the strength to haul heavy loads of contaminated metal or life-giving water. Marius, the broken man, was now the project's center. Vlad wasted no time. He gathered the key personnel, 3 strong men, 2 women known for their sharp eyes and sewing skills, and me. The maggot farm starts now, Vlad announced, pointing to Marius. Marius is the architect. He will design the beds and the ventilation. Nikolai will assist him. This is an engineering task, and it needs a mind that can measure and plan, not just write. You will both report to me when the first batch is ready. I felt a surge of pride and adrenaline. My task was no longer just chronicling despair, it was building the foundation of hope. Marius, too, seemed to find a sudden, fragile purpose. The sorrow remained in his eyes, but his hands, the hands of a mechanic and a carpenter, were steady. He quickly started sketching diagrams on a spare piece of canvas with a chunk of charcoal. We need lumber for frames, Marius instructed, his voice rusty but authoritative. It must be dry and rot-resistant. The air has to be controlled. Maggots need warmth, darkness, and humidity to grow fast. They hate the dry cold of the vault. We'll use the piglets as the starter material, but we'll need scavenged leather and canvas to seal the growing beds. He then pointed to a rough drawing of a tiered box system. This is the nursery. We place the piglets here. As the larvae grow, they drop through a mesh into a second box, the harvest box. The older they are, the more protein they hold. No cross-contamination, clean harvest. It was brilliant. A system designed to turn death into guaranteed, reliable life. The scavenge for metal. The next day, Vlad organized the first engine hunt. He chose 2 strong women, Anna and Eliza, who were experts at silent movement and had an uncanny knack for spotting usable wires and rare plastics. Marius, though still weak, insisted on coming. He knew what to look for, the hidden value in a pile of twisted junk. And I, the newly designated driver in training, was tasked with being Marius's shadow. We were back on the iron road, but this time the journey was different. It wasn't about avoiding the metal monsters, it was about dissecting them. The engine, Marius explained to me, his voice a low, steady rumble, is the heart. It takes fire and turns it into movement. But the transmission is the brain. It decides how the power gets to the wheels. We need that. And the chassis, the frame, it must be simple and strong, like a cart, not complicated and heavy like a tank. We moved from husk to husk, Marius touching the cold metal with reverence, as if trying to reawaken the sleeping giants. This is a Volvo, he said, tapping the corroded badge on a massive silver wreck. Too complicated, too much computer, no good for us. He moved to a small, brightly colored car that had been crushed flat, its wheels splayed out like the legs of a dead insect. This is a Dacia, built simple, tough. This wheel hub, this is good. Anna and Eliza immediately started working, stripping the chassis of usable tires, wires, and even glass, working with silent efficiency. But Marius stopped at a massive rusting green block of metal, a military transport perhaps from the 10-year war. Its engine block was exposed, a jagged cavity of steel. This, Marius whispered, his face alight with true purpose for the first time. This is what we need. It's a diesel engine, runs on anything oily. Simple valves, powerful. If we can get this out, we can build a true monster, something that can carry a ton of water, something that can outrun the Raiders' cars. The engine block was immovable, fused to the chassis by 40 years of dust and corrosion. It was heavy, far too heavy for 4 people to carry, even if they could pry it loose. It's too much, Marius, Vlad stated, his voice tight. We need smaller parts first. We cannot risk a day hauling this. Marius, however, was already a mechanic again, not a broken survivor. He had already seen the solution. We don't take the whole engine, Elder, Marius countered, pulling a rusted heavy wrench from his scavenged tools. We take the injector pump and the starter motor. If these survive the blast and the corrosion, we can use them to rebuild a smaller engine back in the vault. We take the heart's essential organs. He handed me the wrench. You want to learn to drive, Nikolai? You start here. You learn what makes the power, and you learn how to take it apart. The world is built on taking apart what's broken and using the pieces to make something new. This is your first lesson, boy. I took the wrench, the cold, heavy steel settling in my hand. It was the heaviest piece of history I had ever held. I was no longer just the recorder. I was now an apprentice to the engine. The language of the machine. Back in the vault workshop with the maggot nursery successfully sealed and awaiting its first harvest, my focus shifted entirely to the cold, scavenged metal. Marius sat on a stool. The injector pump, a dense, fist-sized piece of rusted iron, on the stone slab between us, gleaming slightly where he had scrubbed away the worst of the grime. The starter motor, a heavy cylinder of wire and magnets, lay beside it. "You've spent your life writing down the pride of nations, Nikolai," Marius said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Now you will learn the humility of the machine. History is chaotic. An engine is harmony. It follows rules. You are not a writer here. You are an engine doctor, and this monster is your patient." I leaned in, pencil forgotten, ready to listen. "This piece," he tapped the injector pump, "is the whisperer of fire. The elder called fuel the black blood. If the engine is the heart, then this whisperer is the valve that controls the blood flow. It takes the rough, dirty oil we find, the dregs of the before-world, and measures it perfectly. It doesn't pour it in. It sprays it. It doesn't shout its demands for power. It whispers the precise amount needed for the explosion." He picked up the pump. "It's the most sensitive part. If the whisperer is choked with dust, the heart dies. If it is too greedy with the fuel, the heart explodes. A good doctor is precise. A good whisperer is exact." Next, he picked up the heavier starter motor. "And this is the waker. The heart of the diesel block, the pistons and cylinders, doesn't start on its own. It needs a jolt of life. This waker needs the lightning's touch, the power stored in a battery, to give the engine that first violent turn. It gives the impulse of creation." Marius placed them side by side. The waker brings the heart to life, and the whisperer keeps it beating by giving the blood to the four brothers, the pistons, who beat the war drums of combustion inside the engine block. Your job is to make sure they all work together in silence, with respect for each other and without waste. He looked up, meeting my eyes with a challenging intensity. The politicians and their armies brought the fire of the nukes, an uncontrolled catastrophe that destroyed the world. We, the engine doctors, must contain the fire inside this metal box, to create a contained, useful catastrophe that saves the world. Do you see the difference, Nikolai? One fire takes life. The other fire sustains it. I didn't need a pencil to record that. The lesson was etched onto my soul. He wasn't teaching me mechanics. He was teaching me philosophy of survival. The great folly of the past was waste and greed. The great truth of the future was precision and harmony. "I see the difference, Marius," I said, placing my hand on the cold iron of the injector pump. "The whisperer of fire. I will learn its secrets." Marius nodded, his lips forming the closest thing to a genuine, if tired, smile I had ever seen. "Then you are no longer just the recorder, Nikolai. You are now a monster master, and the life of this community, and the safety of the vault, now depends on the strength of the heart you rebuild. A new purpose." I started my apprenticeship immediately. I spent hours cleaning the minute gears and valves of the injector pump, learning to read the language of rust and corrosion. Marius, meanwhile, started stripping the massive military engine block we salvaged for its durable chassis material. He wanted to use the strongest frame to build a simple, open-top transport vehicle. "We will call it the Ghoul Getter," he declared, using his carpentry skills to begin building a reinforced wooden bed for the back, strong enough to hold hundreds of gallons of water. He was right. The engine required a kind of focused meditation that the archive never did. Recording history meant absorbing the chaos of the world. Rebuilding the engine meant imposing order onto chaos. I was becoming an engineer of the present, grounded in metal and oil, finally seeing a purpose beyond the dusty ruins of the past. Ghoul Getter schematics, the engine doctor's journal I, the philosophy of the machine. The Philosophy of the Machine, by Nikolai, Monster Master Apprentice, Year 40F. Marius taught me that the engine is not a pile of metal but a living creature. Its heart is strong, but its soul demands precision. The great miscalculation that killed the before-world was pride and waste. The Ghoul Getter, this beast of metal and salvaged fire, must operate on humility and exactness. Marius's warning. The beast can kill you if you do not give it exactly what it needs. I must be an engine doctor, not a politician. I must follow the rules of the machine, not the chaos of the heart. The heart of the ghoul getter, salvaged diesel block. The engine block is a contained catastrophe. It is the new fire that sustains us, unlike the nuclear fire that consumed the past. Our job is to manage the explosion, ensuring every ounce of fuel creates useful movement, not waste. 1. The Waker, the starter motor. Location: attached to the flywheel time bell housing. Purpose: to give the first violent turn. It is the impulse of creation. Necessity: needs the lightning's touch, battery power, to shock the engine from sleep. Without it, the heart is inert. Our scavenged Waker is a heavy cylinder of wire and magnets. Raw, powerful life. 2. The Whisperer of Fire, the injector pump. Location: central to the engine block, connected to the fuel lines. Purpose: to precisely control the flow of fuel. The ultimate lesson in humility. Necessity: this is the most sensitive part. It does not pour, it sprays the exact minute dose of fuel needed. If the Whisperer is too greedy or imprecise, the entire contained catastrophe fails. A good doctor is precise. A good Whisperer is exact. 3. The Four Brothers, the pistons and cylinders. Location: inside the core engine block, the core. Purpose: to beat the war drums of combustion. They compress the fire, use its energy to drive the wheels, and then expel the smoke. Necessity: they must work together in harmony. The life of the community now depends on the steady, rhythmic beat of these four brothers working without envy or conflict. The bone structure, chassis, and drivetrain. The ghoul getter must be simple, strong, and adaptable to the iron road. It cannot be complicated like the Volvo husks of the before world. 4. The chassis, the frame. Design: a simple, open-top transport vehicle. The base is the heavy, durable military frame salvaged by Marius. Simple, like a cart, but strong enough to haul a ton of water. Material: reinforced steel from the military vehicle, overlaid with carpentry for the strong, simple wooden cargo bed. 5. The transmission, the brain. Purpose: to translate the engine's power into usable speed for the wheels. It is the decision maker for movement. Necessity: we need a simple mechanical gearbox to manage the power, as the electronic brains of the past are all useless dust. The ghoul getter is a lesson. The fire of the before world was uncontrolled. Our fire is contained, measured, and serves only survival. We are building the future with the organs of the past. The engine doctor's oath. The pencil finally stopped moving. I had finished the schematic detailing the Waker and the Whisperer of Fire, the essential organs of the beast. It wasn't just a drawing. It was the final examination of my apprenticeship. I had translated Marius's warnings and philosophy into a precise, usable document. The ghoul getter was now real, not just in salvaged metal, but in calculated form. I looked at the blueprint for the contained catastrophe, and then at the old rusted emblem of the United States of Europe on the shelf. The contrast was stark. The before world's arrogance led to the chaos of the nukes, uncontrolled, wasteful fire that turned the sky red. Our future, the ghoul getter, was built on humility and exactness. Fire contained to serve life, not consume it. The beast would require the black blood, fuel, for its sustained breath and the lightning's touch, a functional battery, to wake its heart. These final components were not in the safety of the vault. They were out there, in the deadly silence of the iron road, waiting past the silent sentinel, likely guarded by the very radiation that Marius warned would kill me. Marius was no longer just the broken man. He was the master of the fire, the one who saw that the machine must be respected like a god. His pleasure was the sheer competence of survival, and his fear was the reflection of the past in our own ambition. I closed my journal. I was no longer just the recorder of loss, burdened by the ghosts of dead countries. I was the monster master, the engine doctor. My new task was simple: to go out into the ashlands, face the raiders and the buzzards, and steal the essential lifeblood needed for our future. I stood up, securing my knife and checking the flint and tinder. The next day the copper sky would rise, and I would leave the safety of the vault with Marius and the Elder. We had charted the machine's organs. Now we had to harvest its life. The ghoul-getter was waiting, and I was ready. Then Marius whispered to me, tapping the drawing. "You've named the beast well, Nikolai.